Something happened on the 15th of April 2026 that most people scrolled right past, and it might turn out to be the single most important sentence Elon Musk posted all year. He said a chip called AI-5 had just taped out. 4 words, no fanfare. But if you understand what a tape out actually means, you understand that Tesla just locked in the architecture for the brain that is supposed to go inside a humanoid robot walking around a Tesla factory floor within the next few years. And buried inside that same announcement was a number that should stop you in your tracks. Somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 trillion operations per second. That is not a typo. That is not marketing rounding. That is roughly 5 to 8 times more raw computing power than what currently sits inside Tesla's most advanced vehicles today. So the real question tonight is not whether Optimus can walk or whether it can pick up a box. The real question is whether Tesla just quietly built the most important piece of industrial hardware in the entire humanoid robot race, and whether the rest of the world is only now starting to notice. Let's slow down, because there are 2 separate stories getting mashed together in headlines right now, and if you don't separate them, you will walk away with the wrong picture. Story number 1 is Optimus Generation 3, the physical robot. Story number 2 is AI-5, the chip. They are related, but they are not the same thing, and the gap between them is exactly where the real drama lives. In February of 2026, Tesla showed off a new set of hands for Optimus. 22 degrees of freedom per hand, 50 actuators total. If those numbers mean nothing to you, here is the translation. A human hand is one of the hardest machines in nature to replicate, because it is not just about strength. It is about 1,000 tiny adjustments happening every second, tendons pulling in coordination, pressure sensing, grip adapting in real time. Tesla moved the tendon mechanisms back into the forearm, the same basic engineering trick your own body uses. And that alone tells you their engineers were not just building a prop for a stage demo. They were solving one of the oldest unsolved problems in robotics. But hands need a brain to tell them what to do, and that is where AI-5 comes back into the picture. Musk has said this chip is intended to be the inference computer running inside Optimus Generation 3. Inference, in plain English, just means the moment where the machine looks at the world through its cameras and has to decide right now in real time what it is looking at and what to do about it. That decision has to happen in a fraction of a second, and it has to happen using onboard hardware, because you cannot send a video feed to a data center every time a robot needs to decide whether it is about to step on a cat. So the more compute you can pack into that onboard chip, the more the robot can perceive, the faster it can react, and the less it depends on a cloud connection that might lag or drop entirely. Here is where the industry starts to feel less like a robotics story and more like a chip war. Tesla's previous vehicle computer, often called Hardware 3, ran at roughly 144 trillion operations per second. The newer Hardware 4, sometimes called AI-4, pushed that into the 300 to 500 range. AI-5 is being positioned at somewhere close to 2,000 to 2,500. That is not an incremental bump. That is the kind of jump that usually takes an industry a full decade to achieve, and Tesla is claiming to do it in a single generation. Musk has also thrown out comparisons like 8 times the raw compute and 9 times the memory of the prior chip, with memory capacity reportedly climbing toward 144 gigabytes. Numbers like that do not just mean faster video processing. They mean the difference between a robot that recognizes a hammer and a robot that understands what a hammer is for, in context, in a cluttered garage next to a dozen other tools that look similar. Now here's the part almost nobody is talking about, and it is the detail that separates a real investigative breakdown from a hype reel. Tesla has not published an official spec sheet stating that Optimus Generation 3, the robot itself, contains 2,500 trillion operations per second of usable compute. What has actually been confirmed is narrower and frankly more interesting. AI-5 taped out in April. Its claimed system-level performance sits in that 2,000 to 2,500 range, and Tesla intends for AI-5 to become the brain of Optimus Generation 3. Intends, not currently shipping inside every unit walking around Fremont today. Volume production of AI-5 is targeted for 2027, a full year or more after Optimus Generation 3 itself is supposed to begin production in the summer of 2026. So sit with that gap for a second. Tesla is about to start building the robot's body before the robot's most advanced brain is even in mass production. That is not a scandal. That is how hardware companies operate when they are racing against a calendar instead of waiting for perfection. But it is a detail that deserves 15 seconds of honesty before anyone repeats the phrase 2,500 tops brain as if it were a finished, audited shipping specification. It isn't, not yet. It is a target tied to a chip that exists on a wafer right now and will exist inside factories in volume roughly a year from now. If you want to know why Tesla is willing to accept that awkward timing gap, you have to zoom out from the robot entirely and look at the company's actual playbook. Because this was never just about building a humanoid that can walk in a straight line. Every serious player in this race, from Figure to Boston Dynamics to Agility to the entire NVIDIA ecosystem, is trying to solve some version of the same puzzle. Tesla's bet is that dexterity alone does not win this race. Ownership of every layer underneath the robot wins the race. Think about what Tesla already controls that almost nobody else in this industry controls simultaneously. Its own silicon design, now in a 5th generation chip. Its own battery packs, refined over more than a decade of electric vehicle production. Its own actuator manufacturing. Its own AI training infrastructure, built originally to solve full self-driving, now being repurposed to teach a robot how to fold laundry or sort parts on a line. And its own factories, real ones, already running, where Optimus units are currently being tested internally in Fremont and at Giga Texas. Not selling, not shipping to customers, learning, walking hallways, picking up objects, generating the exact kind of real-world data that a lab robot sitting in a university basement will never have access to. That vertical stack is the actual golden fact buried in this story, more than the TOPS number itself. A chip is useless without training data. Training data is useless without a factory to deploy the robot into and collect more of it. A factory is useless without batteries powerful enough to run a robot for a full shift. And none of it matters if the actuators inside the hands cannot survive repeated real-world stress. Tesla is the only company on the planet right now claiming to have functioning in-house control over every single one of those layers at the same time. Not the best at each individual layer necessarily, but present in all of them, which is a very different kind of threat to competitors than simply having the most dexterous hand or the flashiest demo video. And this is where the geopolitics sneaks in, because you cannot talk about a 2500 TOPS chip in 2026 without talking about where it is actually manufactured. Reporting points to Samsung's fabrication facility in Taylor, Texas, alongside a dual sourcing relationship involving TSMC's Arizona operations. Translation: Tesla is deliberately trying to keep its most important robotic brain manufactured on American soil, at a moment when the entire global economy is nervously watching semiconductor supply chains after years of shortages and export restrictions. That is not an accident, and it is not just patriotism for a press release. It is a hedge against the exact kind of chip war that has already reshaped the automotive industry once this decade. If you remember the years when a missing $8 chip could shut down an entire assembly line building $80,000 vehicles, you understand exactly why Tesla wants its next-generation brain built inside its own hemisphere, under its own supply chain, as much as physically possible. Now let's talk about scale, because this is the part of the story that gets exaggerated the fastest, and where a documentary loses credibility the moment it starts repeating numbers as if they were already true. You will see headlines throwing around figures like 1 million robots a year, or even 10 million, or a wild number like 27,000 robots produced per day. Every single one of those numbers is a target, an aspiration, a long-term goal stated publicly by Musk, not a confirmed production rate happening today. What is actually happening today is smaller and honestly more believable. Tesla has discussed converting portions of its Model S and Model X production lines at Fremont to eventually build Optimus units at meaningful volume. Internal testing is underway right now inside real factories. That is the truth as it stands in the middle of 2026. The jump from that reality to millions of humanoid robots per year is not guaranteed, and treating it as inevitable would be dishonest. What is fair to say is that Tesla has publicly declared this ambition at the highest levels of the company, including on earnings calls, and that the entire chip and factory strategy you just heard about only makes sense if leadership genuinely believes that scale is coming. So where does that leave us? Somewhere between hype and substance, which, if you have followed this industry long enough, is usually exactly where the most important stories in it actually live. The honest version of this headline is not that Tesla revealed a finished 2,500 TOPS robot brain ready to ship tomorrow. The honest version is that Tesla taped out a chip aimed at that performance range, showed off genuinely impressive 22 degree of freedom hands with 50 actuators, started internal testing of a new robot generation inside real factories, and is now racing to close the gap between a chip that exists on paper in volume by 2027 and a robot body that is supposed to start rolling off lines by the summer of 2026. That gap is uncomfortable. It is also, if you think about it honestly, exactly the kind of gap every major hardware leap in history has had to survive. The first iPhone shipped before the App Store existed. The first electric vehicle shipped before fast charging networks were built out. Tesla is betting that shipping the body first and catching up the brain second is survivable, because the alternative, waiting for every layer to be perfect before moving, has never once been how this company has operated. Here is the question worth sitting with before you close this video. If Tesla can genuinely combine a chip pushing 2,500 trillion operations per second, hands with true human-level dexterity, years of real-world factory data, and a manufacturing engine built to punch out vehicles by the hundreds of thousands, does the label robot even still apply? Or does Optimus quietly become something closer to a new category of industrial worker, manufactured the same way a car is manufactured, upgraded the same way software is upgraded, and deployed the same way a fleet of vehicles is deployed? That is not a science fiction question anymore. That is a supply chain question, a chip fabrication question, and a factory floor question, all happening in Texas and Fremont right now in real time. Because the deeper you look into this story, the more it becomes clear that the actual breakthrough was never going to be the robot standing there on a stage waving at a camera. The real breakthrough, the one worth watching closely over the next 18 months, is the invisible machine being built underneath it. The chip, the factory, the battery supply chain, the training data pipeline, the manufacturing system quietly being assembled piece by piece to eventually turn artificial intelligence into something that can physically show up and do a shift of work. So keep an eye on two dates more than any marketing headline: April of 2026, when AI 5 taped out, and sometime in 2027, when it is supposed to actually ship at volume. Everything interesting about whether this technology becomes real is going to happen in that window. And if you want to make sure you are not caught off guard by whatever comes out of that window, when the rest of the industry is still arguing about whether a robot can fold a shirt, join us here, because this is exactly the kind of shift that ends up parked in your garage before most people even see it coming.